Good day. Amid reports appearing in places like Politico that Democrats are beginning to worry that President Biden's administration is sinking under the weight of too many foreign policy crises, we await the American response to the attack on the American base in Jordan, or to be more precise, a facility in Jordan which appears to be connected in some way with the American base in Syria at Al-Tanf. I will return to this particular issue, the question of the Middle East, later in this program. I will first start with the situation in Ukraine, where there's been a lot of important news and where, in fact, we have rather clearer picture of what is happening on the various battlefronts. But the big news from Ukraine yesterday was not about the situation on the battlefronts. It was about the crisis, the political crisis in Kiev. And I think that it is fairly clear that yesterday President Zelensky made a serious and very real attempt to finally dismiss his commander-in-chief, his military commander, General Zaluzhny. Now, there was a massive cascade of reports about this that poured out from Kiev across the day. They came from multiple sources, from people within the Ukrainian parliament, from various telegram channels. Some of the comments appeared to be pro-Zaluzhny, others appeared to be pro-Zelensky, but it's clear that some kind of big event was underway. And reports then started to trickle through about how Zaluzhny had been dismissed, that Budanov was taking his place, that Zaluzhny was actually in the process of clearing his office in preparation for Budanov taking over and moving in, that Zaluzhny had refused an offer of an ambassadorship in some Western state. And then, of course, as the day progressed and as the rumour mill operated at high intensity, we got the report from the Ukrainian Defense Ministry that it was all fake news and that Zaluzhny was still in place. And then several hours later, Zelensky's own office also released a terse statement saying that it was not the case that President Zelensky had in fact dismissed General Zaluzhny. Zelensky himself, by the way, so far has said nothing, and nor has General Zaluzhny. When I said nothing, I mean that neither man has appeared in public and has denied the rumours and has said that the speculation that there is an attempt by President Zelensky himself to get rid of General Zaluzhny, neither man has come out and said that this is untrue and that their relationship is intact and that they're continuing to work successfully together. And there were reports afterwards, after the statement from the Defense Ministry, there were reports from some of the telegram channels, the Ukrainian telegram channels, that the decision to sack Zaluzhny had been blocked by the United States, and that there's been meetings apparently being held in Zelensky's offices in the Bankovka complex in Kiev, trying to find some way round this block from the United States on Zaluzhny's dismissal. And there were also reports earlier today that over the course of yesterday, Zelensky and Zaluzhny actually had a meeting, apparently a very tense meeting, in which Zelensky informed Zaluzhny of his dismissal, asked him instead to resign. Zaluzhny responded that he was, if the president, meaning presumably Zelensky, wanted him to go, he would go, but that he was not prepared to resign, and he was not prepared to write a resignation letter, another act of defiance, it would seem, by a General Zaluzhny, who clearly has intense disrespect for the man, Zelensky, who, according to the military hierarchy, is technically his commander-in-chief. So, a very complex day, and it's important to stress that we don't know the actual truth of any specific particular rumor. We don't know whether Zelensky and Zaluzhny did meet. We don't know whether the reports of this meeting are being conveyed accurately. In fact, it's almost certain that they are not. Someone, either Zelensky or Zaluzhny, is spinning what happened over the course of that meeting. We don't know whether it's true that the Bankovka complex was the venue of long meetings, debating means of getting rid of Zaluzhny and overcoming American opposition to his dismissal. And we don't know whether the United States did in fact intervene on Zaluzhny's behalf, and we don't know whether in fact any, as I said, specific rumor is actually true, whether Zaluzhny did start packing his bags in his office in preparation for his exit. So, a complex day. Notice that at no point over the course of the day was there any public statement, any confirmation in the media, formal confirmation from the Ukrainian government that Zaluzhny had in fact been dismissed. And there's even a story doing the rounds, which I don't take particularly seriously, by the way, that Zelensky is not in a position to dismiss Zaluzhny without a formal request from the Ukrainian Defense Minister, Rustem Umerov, and that the actual block on Zaluzhny's dismissal is coming from Umerov, who, for whatever reason, either because he's been pressured by the Americans or, well, perhaps because he's now engaging in some kind of internal political game in Ukraine, that he, which he's aiming for, that he's in effect preventing Zelensky from having Zaluzhny sacked. Well, despite public announcements, despite public confirmation that an attempt was made to sack Zaluzhny yesterday, it seems to me that we would not have had this vast cascade of reports from Kiev unless some actual attempt to sack Zaluzhny took place. I mean, there's that awful expression, no smoke without fire. In 99 cases out of 100, to my knowledge, that is either untrue or worthless. But in this case, the smoke was so strong and the flickers of the flames were so obvious that it's clear that something actually did, in fact, happen. And that brings us back to this underlying question: why is it proving so difficult for Zelensky to have Zaluzhny sacked? And why is Zaluzhny, for his part, so determined to cling on? And I'm going to make a number of suggestions here, and I want to stress again, this is pure guesswork now. I have no inside information from Kiev. Neither Zelensky nor Zaluzhny nor their various teams keep me informed about what is actually going on. But I think in Zelensky's case, he does most definitely want to sack Zaluzhny. He probably is running into opposition, but I suspect that that opposition is not coming so much from the Americans as from the ground forces, the military leadership in Ukraine, who do not want Zelensky to appoint Budanov in succession to Zaluzhny, and who do not want Zelensky to take a tighter control of the conduct of the war. It's likely that some of the commanders have little time for Zaluzhny himself. There's long known to be a feud underway between Syrsky, General Syrsky, the ground forces commander who's running things in the northern part of the battlefronts, and Zaluzhny. But as it seems that General Syrsky has been ruled out from taking overall command, from replacing Zaluzhny, it seems as if even Syrsky probably prefers Zaluzhny to be in charge than someone like Budanov. So I suspect that talk about the Americans is essentially an alibi. The real opposition comes from within the military, and that probably explains why the defense minister, Rustem Umarov, is said to be opposed to this dismissal. So that's, I suspect, what is blocking this operation, even though it's clear that Zelensky doesn't trust Zaluzhny, wants to get rid of him. He sees Zaluzhny as insubordinate, which he clearly is, by the way, and he probably suspects Zaluzhny, with good cause, by the way, of having political ambitions of his own. Now, why, for his part, does Zaluzhny take this incredible stance of refusing to quit, even though that is the undoubted wish of the man, Zelensky, who is his commander-in-chief? Now, there's no doubt at all that Zaluzhny has little time for Zelensky, that he deeply disrespects Zelensky, which is unsurprising. Most people would probably be on Zaluzhny's side on that front. But ultimately, Zaluzhny is a soldier. Soldiers are supposed to follow orders, and it must be obvious to Zaluzhny that his commander-in-chief, who is Zelensky, wants him to go, and yet he is insisting on staying. And as I've discussed in previous programs, it is anyway utterly bizarre for the military commander to continue in post when he knows that he no longer has the trust and confidence of the commander-in-chief. This is insubordination on an extreme scale. It goes beyond the insubordination that Yevgeny Prigozhin of the Wagner Group was indulging in this time last year during the battle for Bakhmut, and which culminated in his rebellion against President Putin's authority in June. So why is Zaluzhny digging in? Well, as we said, he no doubt disrespects Zelensky, but I'm going to suggest that he is also at some level personally afraid, because it's clear that Zelensky sees him as a political threat. It's clear that Zelensky no longer trusts him. There's already a criminal investigation of Zaluzhny underway on the basis that he allowed the Russians to capture Kherson city in some way back in the first weeks of the special military operation in March, or was it February 2022? And it seems to me that Zaluzhny probably worries that if he is dismissed or if he does resign, he will be arrested the following day. That the Zelensky authorities, seeing Zaluzhny as a political rival, will want to remove him from the scene by having him arrested and prosecuted on various charges. Charges of abandoning southern Ukraine to the Russians in 2022, possibly, conceivably, other charges as well. There was that very strange story that appeared a few weeks ago, published by Seymour Hersh, of Zaluzhny being in direct contact with the Russian commander, General Gerasimov. I've made it clear that I don't believe that story, but it could be that that story is in part being circulated in order to undermine Zaluzhny and to provide further grounds for Zaluzhny's dismissal. And it is not inconceivable, if there are some contacts between Zaluzhny's people and the Russians, perhaps on prisoner of war exchanges, that might all link in some way to the Ilyushin 76 incident, when a plane with a party of Ukrainian POWs was shot down by the Ukrainian military over Belgorod. I discussed this some days ago. So I think this is why, more than anything else, Zaluzhny is digging in. He doesn't want to be sacked, not just because he's worried about what Zelensky will do if he takes over, but because he's worried about himself. And bear in mind, we're talking about a political conflict which has taken a vicious turn, with one of Zaluzhny's top aides being killed in a mysterious explosion of a grenade that was supposed to be a gift to him, and in which Kirill Budanov, the man who's supposed to take over from Zaluzhny, has had his wife poisoned. So the stakes are very high. Now, putting all that aside, a situation where the commander-in-chief, that's to say Zelensky, and his main military subordinate, which is to say Zaluzhny, loathe and detest and mistrust each other and are plotting and conspiring against each other, whether one is trying to dismiss the other and the other stands his ground, well, that is a recipe for disaster on the battlefronts. It means that decision-making about what happens in the ground operations on the front lines is all but impossible. And it all but guarantees that increasingly eccentric and chaotic decisions will be taken. Beyond that, all of these rumors are, of course, also going to act in order to demoralize the situation in Kiev itself. I mean, consider first of all Zaluzhny's position. He must be extremely tense and insecure as he senses that Zelensky and his people are trying to remove him, and that must be affecting his ability to make decisions in order to conduct the war. And Zelensky himself must be deeply alarmed and very frightened by the insubordination of his senior general. And in fact, there's been a rather interesting article in Focus, which is a German magazine, and it's by a journalist, Gabor Steingartz, and it points out that in a recent interview, Zelensky looked extremely tense and depressed. He was no longer the ebullient and optimistic person that he had seemed in the past. And this is a machine translation that I'm using, but it contains words like this. The face suited the situation. Zelensky looked contrite when he appeared on Karen Miozga's ARD talk show last night. He was no longer the wartime president, confident of victory, but a man whose desire to fight seemed strained. And we're told that the deteriorating situation on the battlefront is clearly part of the reasons why he is becoming increasingly depressed. We learn that he's increasingly worried about the possible election of Donald Trump in the United States and the ending of American aid. The article says that time is running out on him and on Ukraine. And then we have a whole list of reasons why Zelensky might be depressed. The fact that arming Ukraine is no longer possible on the scale that it was. The fact that it's necessary for Ukraine to sit down and negotiate. And that this might mean that concessions need to be made and all of that. Well, all of that is true. And there's no doubt that all of these would be good reasons for depression by themselves. But let me reiterate again, I have little doubt that the single biggest reason why Zelensky is depressed at the moment, aside from the crisis on the battlefronts, is the collapse of his relationship with his senior general, whom he cannot get rid of. That must make him extremely stressed and very nervous and probably very frightened and uncertain about what to do. Well, that's all I can say about this affair. Clearly, we've got further to go. There are some people, Dima at the Military Summary channel being one, who are suggesting that Zaluzhny is playing for time, that Zelensky's constitutional term as president ends on the 30th of March. Zelensky has ruled out elections, presidential elections this year, that what Zaluzhny might be intending to do is wait until Zelensky's term ends and then tell Zelensky that the calling off of elections is not actually provided for in the martial law provisions of Ukrainian law, and that without elections, Zelensky's position has become unconstitutional, and it is he, therefore, who should resign. That might be the plan, and of course, if Zaluzhny can then force Zelensky's removal after the 30th of March, well, that would be, in a way, a kind of coup, but one which could be sugar-coated or explained away or rationalized as having been carried out in accordance with Ukraine's constitution. Anyway, we will have to wait and see. This issue is not resolved. At some point, it will be, and we will see how that will happen. We came closer than we ever have yesterday to a public blowout in Kiev. Sooner or later, unless this situation is resolved, that public blowout will happen, and we'll see how Ukrainian society, how the military, how the security agencies, and the various nationalist factions respond when that happens. Now, none of this would be taking place were it not the case that the situation on the battlefronts is deteriorating. And my sense is that this deterioration is now becoming faster, that the situation on the battlefront is becoming more critical for Ukraine. Now, there's been more information over the last 24 hours about major Russian advances in the Kupiansk area. Now, my impression is that the situation on the battlefronts, from Ukraine's point of view, is deteriorating, that the pace of the Russian advances is accelerating, and that this is probably one of the reasons why there is this looming crisis in Kiev. And I think one point I'm going to make is that all across the line of contact now, it's not just that the Russians have the initiative, but over the last 24 hours, the only reports of attacks that I have been reading are of Russian attacks on Ukrainians, not Ukrainian attacks on Russians. Now, no doubt there are local counterattacks taking place in various places, but overall the picture is one of Russian attacks, and they seem to be taking place right across the contact line. And perhaps, for the moment at least, the fastest point of acceleration of the Russian advance is on the northern front lines around Kupiansk and in the Siversk Liman area. Now, there are reports, again, there have been many such reports of the Russians now gradually taking Sinkovka, this village to the west of Bakhmut, to the west of Kupiansk, into some kind of a vice. But the Russians, according to many reports, have made now significant advances south of Kupiansk and Sinkovka, along this line of villages. A couple of days ago, they captured Tabayevka. The reports now confirm that, as I guessed yesterday, they are indeed in control of the heights to the west of Tabayevka, and indeed to a significant zone of territory near Tabayevka itself. There are reports that they've cut a road leading to two further villages, Kislovka and Kotlerovka. I'm probably getting the names of these villages wrong. And in any event, it looks likely that they will capture these two villages also very soon. And there's some debate about what they might do next. Mikhail Valterson suggests that they might push on to westward towards a village called Peshenia. He thinks that Ukrainian fortifications in the Peshenia area are very weak. Dima, at the Military Summary Channel, on the contrary, appears to think that Ukrainian fortifications around Peshenia, which is on high ground, are very strong, and he thinks that the Russians, rather than advance west to Peshenia and beyond Peshenia towards the Oskol River, are more likely to advance northwards, having secured this area, Tabayevka and these other villages. Well, as I said, I'm not going to second guess any of this. I'm not familiar with the topography. I don't know the ground at all well. At all, in fact, not at all well. So I'm not going to try and second guess what these two people, these two much more erudite people on military matters than me, are saying. Well, we'll no doubt find out over the course of the next couple of days what it is exactly that the Russians intend to do. But anyway, they have brought a significant amount of territory near Kupiansk under their control, and the position of the Ukrainian forces in Kupiansk and along the Oskol River is becoming more precarious. Both Dima and Valterson appear to agree that if the Russians do capture Peshenia, then there is nothing that lies between them and the Oskol River line. They can then roll up the various villages that the Ukrainians control along the Oskol River, and they can attack Kupiansk from the south, and perhaps if they transport troops across the Oskol River, which is narrow in some places and wider in some others, then of course they could begin an even more ambitious operation encircling Kupiansk and perhaps ultimately reversing Ukrainian gains in the Kharkiv region, the ones that Ukraine achieved during its Kharkiv counteroffensive of the autumn of 2022. Anyway, we shall have to wait and see. It's important in this conflict especially not to move too far ahead. And that's a bad situation in the Kupiansk area, and a worse situation, from what I can tell, a little further south in the Liman area. The Russians appear to have conducted fearful attrition on Ukrainian troops in this area. Again, there are reports of significant Russian advances in various forested and regions and along tree lines and in fields around this area. They seem to be working towards perhaps the capture of the town of Makeyevka or the capture of other places. And according to Riba, their immediate objective, or at least not their medium-term objective, is presumably Siversk, which is now looking, again, very vulnerable. And then he suggests that once Siversk and this entire territory is captured, and once the Ukrainian positions east of the Zherebets River have been cleared by the Russians, as he appears to believe they will be, then that will put the Russians in a position where they can strike towards Liman, Krasny Liman, as the Russians call it, and recapture that place as well. So, a very difficult situation for the Ukrainians on their northern front lines. What looks like some sort of a collapse in the Kupiansk area, tough fighting in the Liman area, advances by the Russians towards Siversk, a very bad situation overall. But as I explained in my program yesterday, if you take Russian claims of Ukrainian casualty figures as your guide, the most intense fighting throughout 2023, and by the way, in the first weeks of 2024, continues to be in the fighting around Bakhmut. And here again, we've had a lot more clarification of the situation. It seems that an intense battle is being fought between the Russians and the Ukrainians for control of Bogdanovka. It seems that the Russians are gradually clearing Bogdanovka against intense Ukrainian resistance. Bogdanovka is a large village, much bigger, for example, than Khromovo, at least in terms of its territorial extent, or at least that's how it looks to me on the maps. And it seems that the Russians have now successfully cleared parts of central Bogdanovka. They're moving towards the western part of this large village, and it seems that they're making steady progress. They've captured Ukrainian positions north of Bogdanovka and south of Bogdanovka, even as they press hard in places like the Popka forest to the west of Bakhmut and other places there. And there's also reports, and these reports, I should say, are not completely consistent with each other, but they all point in the same direction, of Russian advances towards Ivanivska, Krasnoye, as the Russians refer to it, that important village west of Chasiv Yar, which the Russians, east of Chasiv Yar, which the Russians, the Wagner organization, never captured during the fighting for Bakhmut last year. But it seems that, again, the Russians perhaps have established a foothold within Ivanivska itself. But in any event, it does seem as if they are gradually clearing the territory around Ivanivska, making Ukrainian positions in Ivanivska increasingly precarious. And, well, one way or the other, it looks like both Bogdanovka and Ivanivska are going to fall under Russian control before very long. Again, I'm not going to try and guess the date. The Russians always conduct these operations in an extremely calculated and incremental way, obviously with the intention of limiting casualties. So once all of these villages are captured, Bakhmut will be secure from Ukrainian counterattack. The Russians will have reached the Chasiv Yar canal. The question then becomes, are they going to cross the canal and take Chasiv Yar itself? Or are they going to do, again, what Dima suggested some time ago, which is advance northward along the east bank of the canal in the direction of Kramatorsk? We shall see. Again, as I said, I'm not going to second guess the situation. And then, what is probably, at the present time, the biggest battle of all, which is the battle around and now within Avdiivka. It seems now universally acknowledged that the Russians secured their gains in southern Avdiivka, that having taken control of the Tsar's Hunt and the air defense base, they have been able to repel frantic Ukrainian counterattacks aimed at pushing them back, that they have also rounded up large numbers of Ukrainian prisoners, inflicted very heavy losses on the Ukrainians, and that they're advancing also, they're pushing towards central Avdiivka from various directions, principally, by the way, from the northeast. The forces in the south, the ones who have captured all this territory, appear to be still consolidating in preparation for further advances. And the Russians also apparently continue this advance towards Keramik in the north and continue to clear Pervomaisky. And again, it is difficult for the moment to see how, despite all this enormous commitment of men, resources and machines, that the Ukrainians are able to reverse the situation. They have been able at various times to slow down the Russian advance in Avdiivka, but they've never been able to stop it completely or to secure Avdiivka's positions. And there's been also more reports from the Marinka area. It seems that the Russians are again busy occupying ground to the west of Marinka. They're continuing to advance in this village of Georgievka, which leads on to Kurakhovo further west. And the capture of Kurakhovo apparently would put Ukrainian supply routes to Vuhledar further south in a critical position. But there's also now reports that the Russians, as well as gradually pushing towards this other village to the southwest of Marinka, the village of Pobieda, that the Russians are also now starting to push north from Marinka towards a second village, also called Krasnogorovka. There's a village north of Marinka called Krasnogorovka. There's a village to the north of Avdiivka, which is also called Krasnogorovka. Avdiivka itself, by the way, lies between these two villages. And in fact, the distance between the advanced units of the Russian army, which appear to be pushing towards the southern Krasnogorovka, and the fighting in Bakhmut, in Avdiivka, is now becoming smaller and smaller. So, if the Russians do advance towards this other Krasnogorovka and eventually capture this village, which is admittedly some time away, well, that would be another obviously major blow for the Ukrainians. But I've read in the past that most of the Ukrainian artillery that shells Donetsk city, and by the way, Donetsk city was again shelled by the Ukrainians yesterday. Well, most of this artillery has been concentrated in this southern village of Krasnogorovka, not the northern village of Krasnogorovka, as I once believed. And anyway, if this village is also captured, and I suspect it is a heavily fortified village, which it might be difficult to capture, but if this village is also captured, then at that point, the siege of Donetsk, which has been underway since 2014 by the Ukrainians, will have been well and truly broken. So anyway, there we go. Lots of Russian advances there. And more Russian advances in other places. The Russians have reactivated their forces in the Vremivka Ledge. They seem to be pushing the Ukrainians back in all sorts of directions. There's once more apparently Russian troops positioned to recapture Staromayorsk, that village the Ukrainians spent so much time trying to capture in the summer, during the summer offensive. Anyway, that village is now also threatened. But the Russians also apparently are well positioned now. They've regained enough ground now to be able to retake various other villages to the north and west, which they'd formerly controlled before the Ukrainian offensive, and which they might now conceivably be in a position to recapture. And lastly, there's more reports of more fighting in Rabotino, in the area of so-called Bradley Square. The Russians apparently have gained a fair amount of ground in this area, and there's even some suggestions that they might eventually, once they've recovered all this ground that they lost in the Rabotino-Verbovoye area, that they might even start considering an advance towards Orekhov, the main Ukrainian base in this region. But that does seem to be some way away. Anyway, overall, Russian advances all along the line of control, and the Ukrainians having to move reserves from one point of weakness on the front lines to another, trying to plug holes, at the same time burning up their reserves, burning up their tanks and equipment, and struggling to hold things together, even as they suffer heavier and heavier losses. And there's been, by the way, an article in Foreign Affairs, which now says that Ukraine has lost around a quarter of its Leopard 2 tanks, which have been completely knocked out by the Russians, and that most of the other Leopard 2s are now so badly smashed up and in such severe need of repair that they are, to all intents and purposes, no longer operational. I have to say, this celebrated tank, the Leopard 2, has seen its reputation crash and burn on the Ukrainian steppes, and one senses that the same would be the case if the Challenger 2s and the Abrams tanks supplied to Ukraine were committed to battle in the same way, which is presumably why they haven't been committed to battle. I've seen one report, by the way, which says that the problems with the Abrams engine means that it is only able to work for 30 minutes. The engine will only work for 30 minutes before blockages take place, which suggests that the Ukrainians have not yet mastered control of the engine and are not replacing the filters as regularly as they need to. Anyway, that's the situation on the battle lines. There's been major Russian drone strikes. There was apparently something like 30 Russian drones, Uranium 2s, launched against Ukraine last night. Interestingly, the Ukrainian air defenses this time only admitted to shooting down half. We're increasingly seeing signs that the Ukrainian air defense system is indeed breaking down. It's struggling to shoot down missiles, and it's having having problems now shooting down slow, propeller-driven subsonic drones. So anyway, Russians able to launch more attacks with drones. Apparently, a very large storage point that the Russians attacked last night. There's big pictures of it burning. Apparently, this attack was carried out by a ground-launched ballistic missile, probably an Iskander-M, and again, it looks as if Ukraine has suffered devastating damage. Now, the problem with Ukraine's air defense system probably explains reports that the United States has been pressing Greece to supply its old S-300 air defense missiles and its Tor air defense missiles, both supplied to Greece by Russia, that it's pressing Greece to supply these systems to Ukraine. This would be entirely contrary to an agreement that Greece made with Russia when Greece originally bought these missiles from Russia. There have been attempts by the Greek government to supply these missiles to Ukraine before. They've run into strong opposition from the Greek public and have in every case up to now been reversed. The story goes that the United States is offering Greece $200 million in return for all these missiles being shipped to Ukraine, and that the Greek government has again decided to accept that money and make that decision and supply these missiles to Ukraine. So, a relationship between Greece and Russia, which has been very important both emotionally and conceivably even in security terms, given Greece's difficult relationship with Turkey. Well, that relationship is now, to all intents and purposes, in the process of being destroyed in order to appease the United States and to fulfill the US's increasingly nebulous objectives in Ukraine. And I say increasingly nebulous objectives because we've now had comments from Secretary Blinken. He said that unless funding is received, unless the Congress authorizes more funding for Ukraine, then all the gains that have supposedly been achieved in Ukraine by the United States since the start of the special military operation in February 2022, all of those gains will be reversed, and well, the situation will become increasingly dire. And we're getting, by the way, more and more increasingly pessimistic comments from European officials about the overall situation in Ukraine. Josep Borrell, the EU's, well, I will call him foreign minister, he's now made yet another pessimistic statement. He says that with respect to Ukraine, he can see no light at the end of the tunnel. He says that Russia's economy and military industries have been degraded. He doesn't explain how, but he says it's not changed anything in terms of Russia's single-minded commitment to the war, which is of course true. And as I said, he sees no light at the end of the tunnel. It was, again, he has been sounding increasingly depressed recently. And it's not, again, difficult to see why, because the reality is that the West has exhausted its resources. It is no longer capable of maintaining the flow of weapons to Ukraine. They have lost the production race with the Russians. The Russians have been increasing weapons production to extraordinary levels. Virtually everybody acknowledges this. Yuri Ignat, the spokesman for Ukraine's air defense service, admits that the Russians are building at least 100 cruise missiles a month. It's probably more than that, actually. And that they've got a stockpile of 900 cruise missiles, which they can still use. Of course, he doesn't explain where that figure has come from. But anyway, the fact is that the Russians can comfortably keep up a missile offensive against Ukraine indefinitely. If they launch, let's say, 150 to 200 cruise missiles a month, well, they're gradually reducing their stockpile, if you believe Ignat's figures, but they're also supplementing it with new production. So that is many, many months of missiles that the Russians can launch at Ukraine with devastating effect in the face of an air defense system that is all but collapsing, and with the Russians now mass producing huge numbers of drones, which are also able to cause colossal damage across Ukraine, and with Russian aircraft becoming ever more aggressive in the way they conduct operations, and with Russian production of precision-guided bombs also increasing all the time as well. And, as I said, no real way around this. The West has done pretty much all it can in terms of supplying air defense systems. And we've seen that the air defense systems the West has provided to Ukraine are not even equal to the air defense system, the legacy system that Ukraine was left by the Soviet Union, based around the S-300. And anyway, the imbalance is growing by the day. And of course, artillery shell production remains the key. Britain is no longer apparently in a position to provide artillery shells to Ukraine. It's run down its stockpile. According to the Wall Street Journal, a rather complicated deal which Britain was trying to negotiate with Japan to buy 155mm artillery shells from Japan, which Britain would then forward to Ukraine. Well, that deal has for some reason fallen through. The Japanese Prime Minister, Mr. Kishida, has now made a rather interesting speech in which he's again said that Japan wants to agree a peace treaty with Russia, even though he insists that Japan will continue to maintain the sanctions against Russia and is not prepared to bargain or negotiate or compromise on the question of its northern territories, that's to say the Kuril Islands, which Russia took control of at the end of the Second World War. Those comments, by the way, of Prime Minister Kishida's have come in for a withering response from Dmitry Medvedev, the vice chairman of Russia's Security Council, who said, what is Kishida talking about? What peace treaty is he thinking of? You can't have it both ways. You can't go on claiming what Medvedev considers Russian territory and imposing sanctions on Russia and have a peace treaty at the same time. Anyway, I'm not going to dwell on that. But anyway, this deal has collapsed. There's a long article in the Financial Times that says it will take at least 2 years for the West to match Russian levels of ammunition production. Now, I suspect that is levels of Russian artillery production that the West guesstimates the Russians achieved at the end of last year. And the reports were that at the end of last year, Russian artillery production had reached around 2 million shells a day. And in 2 years' time, if all the plans were to come to fruition, which is most unlikely, well, it would still be the case that the United States would not be producing anywhere near that number of shells, but they might be producing perhaps around 1 million shells a year. But the best evidence suggests that at the very end of 2023 and currently, Russian production of shells has surged again as new capacity has come on stream. And I had that very interesting report from one of my sources, I'm not going to say which, that it's probably now running at between 4 to 5 million rounds a year, which of course dwarfs anything realistically that the West can do. And the article went on to say that the major bottleneck is the lack of skilled labor. There just aren't manual workers with the necessary skills available in the West who are prepared to go and work in the various armaments factories. That this is the result, this is all in the Financial Times, this is the result of decades of deindustrialization. It now means that the West is simply not in a position to produce shells or other weapons in the quantities needed to match the Russians, and that it is this which is the key bottleneck, which is preventing production of military equipment on the scale needed to redress the situation in Ukraine. Now, I would add to that as I said, I think that the United States, or at least some people in the United States, have been overstating the extent to which the United States has, in fact, achieved increases in shell production. But it seems that at least the United States is increasing its shell production. Perhaps it's doubled it. As I said, one report suggests to just 28,000 rounds a month, which I think is perhaps right. But most of this is concentrated in one factory in the United States. The United States is able to increase shell production in this factory up to a point, despite problems of shortages of antimony, shortages of skilled labour, the fact that the workforce there is apparently quite old, the fact that the machine tools themselves are quite old. They're able to do that because this factory, at least, is state-owned. It's actually owned by the US Army, and that makes it more responsive to instructions to increase shell production. In Europe, where the industry is severely fragmented and shell production is entirely in the hands of private companies, they are refusing, apparently, to increase shell production at anything remotely acceptable levels of cost, because it is simply not profitable for them to do that. And in Europe, at least, shell production remains almost at a standstill. Now, the Europeans have talked incessantly about increasing shell production. I think the penny has now dropped, that they're just not able to do that. And I think that the Europeans have also started to understand that despite all the arms twisting of Hungary to try to get it to agree to the 50 billion euro package, which is, by the way, intended to cover 4 years of spending, not just one, which automatically reduces its size. I think that even in Europe, they're gradually beginning to understand that without the United States, without the full commitment of the United States to this conflict, the entire game is lost. And with doubts increasing in the United States and with Republicans, particularly in the House of Representatives, now apparently solidifying in their opposition, their hostility to further funding in Ukraine, the prospects of getting more support from the United States are dwindling. Now, I received a very interesting email from a member of the community yesterday, which I am going to briefly mention. This person speculated that one of the reasons for Republican opposition to funding for Ukraine is that the Republicans, or at least some of them, are worried that any funding that goes to Ukraine will simply be recycled back, and some of that will end up being donated to the Democratic Party in the forthcoming elections. So Congress would, in effect, be authorizing funding, which through all the usual complicated ways will end up financing the Democrats. Perhaps that is what some Republicans think. I suspect if it is, they have good reasons to think that. But I'm not going to discuss it further, given the sensitivities of this platform to those kind of questions. I just leave the question unanswered and out there. Anyway, one way or the other, as I said, growing pessimism about the situation in Ukraine in the West, growing pessimism and a political crisis in Kiev, no word or thought about negotiations. As I said, I get the sense that a discussion did take place last year in Washington, but the hardliners won. They're hoping that the war can be prolonged until at least beyond November, preventing a collapse before the election. And they calculate that from their point of view, their perspective, it might be better just to let Ukraine lose than to compromise with the devil himself and reach a diplomatic settlement that might end the war on terms advantageous to Russia, which might dent American credibility in Europe, or as they believe, around the world. And of course, there remains this other project of fomenting some kind of insurgency within Ukraine. It's been a rather interesting piece of news about this from the Russian side. And I got taken this from Slavyangrad, and it was one report. I don't know the background of where it came from, but I did find it interesting. But anyway, this report suggested that the Russians are now busy building together a force of around, well, at the moment it numbers around 7,000 men under within the Rosgvardia organization, and apparently former members of the Wagner organization are prominent within this force. And its major function, and it's been built up to be committed to the real areas in Ukraine. Its major role will be counterinsurgency and internal security. And there are even some parallels being made between this force and the Smersh, the real Smersh, not the one you read about in the James Bond novels, which was a internal security and counter-espionage agency created by the Soviet Union during the Second World War, basically to secure the area to the rear of the Red Army as it advanced. And, well, it's been suggested that what we're seeing is a recreation of that. Well, again, I don't want to explore this in too much detail because, as I said, this is one report, and it did appear on Slavyangrad, which, as I've said, I regard as a very reliable source of information. But, well, we'll just have to see. Given all the talk of insurgencies in Ukraine, the West trying to arrange insurgencies in Ukraine, and given the potential role of Budanov, who it seems just failed to be appointed to overall military commander-in-chief yesterday, well, it's perhaps understandable that the Russians are already preparing to take precautions. Anyway, there we are. That is my rundown of the situation in Ukraine. We have a deepening crisis in the Middle East. Secretary Blinken has now come out and said that it is the most dangerous situation in the Middle East since the 1973 war. That's the war between Israel and the Arab states, which in Israel I believe is referred to as the Yom Kippur War. And on that front, a number of people have pointed out that this is an interesting contrast to what Jake Sullivan was saying on the eve of the Hamas attack on Israel, that this was the most stable period in the Middle East for a very long time. We've gone from a period of stability before October to one where we find ourselves now in deep crisis. And as I said at the outset of the program, we are now all awaiting the likely American attack on Iran. Now, there's been a long article about this in Politico, and Politico tells us that various options are being put to the president, and that these options include strikes on Iranian positions in various places in the Middle East, but that they also appear to include strikes on Iranian naval facilities in the Persian Gulf. And it's difficult to see how that would not translate to some kind of attack on Iran itself. And the Politico report also says that the strike, when it comes, will be in multiple waves. There will be several attacks on several locations in Iran and in the Persian Gulf. And again, the article quotes officials close to the administration, basically wringing their hands, saying that the United States does not want to be put in this position, that they want to disengage from the Middle East rather than to commit further to it, to get drawn into another war there, but that they're left with no choice. If they don't respond to this attack on the American base, which killed the 3 Americans, well, then America's credibility will supposedly be shot to pieces, and Iranian aggressiveness will simply increase. So, supposedly, the United States has no choice. Now, I don't buy that at all. I never have done. And of course, this again fails to grasp the key issue, which is why was the situation allowed to deteriorate to the point where we have got here, where the United States appears to be on the brink of a confrontation with Iran, which it absolutely does not need at this time. I have discussed this in many programs, the catastrophic failure of American diplomacy in the Middle East ever since the crisis began on the 7th of October, and it has led us inexorably to this point. Now, I have received over the last 24 hours 2 extremely helpful messages from 2 wonderful members of the community. I'm not going to identify them or say anything about them, who have provided me with much information about the drone attack or the alleged drone attack. It's clear that the attack itself struck a facility that the United States has just across the border from Syria, within Jordan, but which is in some way connected to the Al-Tanf base, which is of course located in Syria itself. And there's various suggestions as to what might have happened, and I'm not going to explore those, though I'm very grateful for the information, as I said, these 2 contributors have brought. I should say that what they say tallies. The point is that this facility that was struck appears to have been itself a launch position. It seems to have had various airfields and helicopter pads and those kind of things. It was some kind of advanced air control point for the area, presumably covering the Al-Tanf base further east in Syria itself. Al-Tanf, the main base there, was located apparently some 20 kilometers away. So, a complex operation. Whoever carried it out seems to know a great deal about the layout of the Al-Tanf base and the vulnerable points and how to confuse various air defense systems that exist around this base and things like that. So we can see that whoever was responsible, and as I've said, there are plenty of potential suspects, was well informed and very sophisticated. And that, I would have thought, would act as a warning against plunging in to a conflict over which the United States has limited means of control, given the fact especially that the United States is already overcommitted in Ukraine. But all the indications are that the president is nonetheless going to give the order to launch these strikes. We're told about how calibrated and measured the decision is going to be. My own experience with the president is that calculation and calibration takes little part in his decisions. His instinct will be to launch the most devastating strike that it is within his power to order. And that, I suspect, is what we're going to get. The Iranians will, of course, respond. They're not going to stand by and let themselves be attacked in this way. They undoubtedly know that if they do, that will simply open the way up for more attacks, with the advocates of strikes against Iran seizing on any failure by Iran to respond as proof of Iran's weakness, and therefore seeing it as a reason to strike further and to strike harder. And so there will be an Iranian response. Now, whether there is any way off this escalatory escalator that we are now on, I don't know. But I come back to what I'm saying, what I was saying yesterday. It seems to me that we are definitely heading towards a wider conflict in the Middle East. The same article in Politico tells us that there are many people in the Democratic Party who are worried that the president is becoming over-engaged in foreign policy, is taking on too many conflicts, is losing track of the already very tense domestic situation within the United States. And I think that is absolutely true. And it also mentions, interestingly, that there are some conservatives in the United States who are also becoming worried that the United States is becoming overcommitted, which is also true. And it seems to me, in general, by the way, that the administration is losing the initiative on multiple fronts: on Ukraine, on the situation in the Middle East, where it effectively ceded control right at the outset to Israel when President Biden went to Jerusalem and embraced Prime Minister Netanyahu, leading us to the situation in which we are now. Anyway, and of course, in US domestic politics, where the president decided, or the administration decided, to seek an order from the Supreme Court of the United States on the issue of the border, rather than try and come to some agreement with Texas. Anyway, there we are. What this all reminds me of, and I have to say this, is the last year of the Carter administration in the 1970s and in 1980, the last 2 years, where the Carter administration began to lose control. Foreign policy crises were exploding all over the place, in Afghanistan, in Iran, obviously, with deployments of missiles in the Middle East, and it was becoming increasingly clear that the president, Jimmy Carter, was reacting to events rather than being on top of them, and was starting to make wrong decisions. And of course, there was ultimately a collapse in the president's authority, and that resulted in a convincing victory for his opponent in the election, Ronald Reagan. Whether we will repeat that outcome this year remains to be seen. But I would have thought that a comparison with the Carter administration and its fate would be both instructive and serve as a warning. Anyway, this is where I'm going to end my program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. You can check out our shop. Buy yourself the amazing things that you will find there. Magic mugs, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, sweatshirts, all those great things. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.